Tonight, we are dimming the lights on one of history's greatest open secrets. The men who looked at each other just a little too long, who wrote letters that would make your therapist raise an eyebrow, who shared baths for decades, called each other things like my dearest, my soul, the one person on earth I cannot live without, and then had the absolute audacity to insist they were simply very good friends. Tonight, we are talking about the men in history called just friends who were, by every available piece of evidence, obviously in love. Have you ever written someone a letter describing them as the other half of my soul? Have you ever moved to a new country because someone you were just friends with moved there first? Have you ever shared a bed with your best friend for 15 years, corresponded with them daily, given them land, titles, your personal fortune, and a state funeral, and then insisted with a completely straight face that it was not like that? These men did constantly, across centuries, across empires, across wars, and we, as historians, looked at all of that evidence and wrote a close friendship, typical of the era. Congratulations! You have just stepped into history's most elaborate game of emotional, plausible deniability. Let us begin where history begins. There is a moment in ancient history that historians have been quietly arguing about for 2,000 years. Alexander the Great, conqueror of Persia, Egypt, and most of the known world, stood at the tomb of Achilles in Troy and did something that every scholar has had to explain away ever since. He placed a wreath on Achilles' grave, and Hephaestion, his closest companion, his second in command, the man who had been at his side since childhood, placed a wreath on the grave of Patroclus. In Greek tradition, Achilles and Patroclus were either heroic best friends or, depending on who you asked, something considerably more. Alexander knew exactly what he was doing. He always did. The wreath was not a coincidence. It was a statement. And it was aimed at Hephaestion, who apparently understood it perfectly. Hephaestion was not a quiet figure in Alexander's life. He was appointed Chiliarch, a title invented specifically for him, which made him effectively the second ruler of an empire that stretched from Greece to the borders of India. He commanded cavalry. He negotiated treaties. He was sent ahead on diplomatic missions because foreign rulers understood that treating Hephaestion well was the fastest way to Alexander's goodwill, and treating him badly was the fastest way to Alexander's fury. There is a story preserved in several ancient sources about the time. Alexander and Hephaestion had a Pavlovich argument. Alexander struck him in a moment of rage. Hephaestion walked away. He did not apologize. He did not grovel. He waited because he knew with the certainty of someone who has been loved consistently for years that Alexander would come back. Alexander came back. He always did. Then Hephaestion died. The physician died. The physician who had been treating him had left to attend a theatrical performance while he was gone. Hephaestion's condition deteriorated catastrophically. By the time anyone could find the physician and bring him back, Hephaestion was dead. Alexander had a physician executed. He directed that the sacred fire of the Persian god, Ahura Mazda, be extinguished throughout the empire, a right normally reserved for the death of a king. Hephaestion had not been a king. The sacred fire of the Persian god went out anyway. Alexander did not leave the body for a day. He ordered mourning across the empire. Not suggested, ordered. The hair cutting, the ritual performed for the closest of kin. Alexander had not performed it for his father. He had not performed it for any general, any friend, any family member. He performed it for Hephaestion, who was, by all official designations, his subordinate. The historian Arrian, writing centuries later, is careful with his language. He says the grief exceeded all proper measure. He says this as an observation, not a criticism. He is noting with the precision of a good historian that the grief was disproportionate to the official relationship and leaving the reader to draw whatever conclusion seems appropriate. Alexander died in Babylon the following year. He never recovered. He survived Hephaestion by 8 months. History filed it under close friendship. Typical of the era before Alexander, before any of them, there was the pair that Alexander was very deliberately invoking when he stood at that tomb in Troy, Achilles and Patroclus, among the oldest and most debated relationships in all of Western literature. Homer's Iliad describes them as the closest of companions, sharing a tent, sharing meals, sharing what appears to be their entire emotional interior lives. When Patroclus dies in battle, Achilles' grief is so absolute that it temporarily removes him from the war entirely. He lies on the ground. He refuses food. He cries so hard his mother, a sea goddess with presumably better things to do, rises from the ocean to comfort him. He returns to the war, but not because he is hailed. He returns because he wants to kill Hector. He kills Hector, drags the body behind his chariot for days, refuses to stop, even when the gods tell him it is dishonoring the dead. His grief has turned into something beyond grief, something that does not have a clean name. Plato, in the Symposium, addresses this relationship directly. Phaedrus argues that Achilles and Patroclus were lovers, and argues this in public, in a context where the argument was apparently not considered scandalous, merely interpretive. He suggests that the depth of Achilles' devotion, his willingness to die after Patroclus rather than go home and live, represents the highest form of love. Homer does not need to label it. He shows you Achilles' face when Patroclus dies and trusts you to understand that the war friendship is not large enough for what you are seeing. 2,500 years of readers have agreed. In 1623, King James I of England wrote a letter to George Villiers, Duke of Buckingham, that historians have been footnoting cautiously for 400 years. In it, James addresses Villiers as his sweet child and wife, and refers to himself as Villiers' dear dad and husband. He writes that he naturally so loves your person, and that God may bless you and my sweet grandchild If you are constructing a defense of this relationship as purely political mentorship, that letter is going to present some challenges. James was 56. Villiers was in his 30s, extraordinarily handsome by all contemporary accounts, had been elevated from minor gentry to the most powerful non-royal position in England, and received from James grants of land, money, titles, and what appears to be the majority of the king's waking attention. The Spanish ambassador, watching all of this, wrote home that he did not quite know what to make of it. The letters between them are the most direct evidence available. James writes to Villiers with a consistency of affection and physical warmth that is qualitatively different from his letters to ministers, advisors, and family members. He writes of missing his company. He writes of the comfort of his presence. He writes things that a cautious man would have phrased more carefully, and James was, in political matters, generally a cautious man. What is notable in retrospect is that James himself never pretended the relationships were something other than what they were. He did not hide the letters. He did not avoid the subject when it came up. He called Villiers his wife. He called himself his husband. He wrote it in a letter and sent it. Whatever else you want to say about James, the first of England, he was not, in this particular area, ambiguous. In 1837, Abraham Lincoln arrived in Springfield, Illinois, young, broke, and in need of somewhere to sleep. A shopkeeper named Joshua Speed offered him half of his bed above the store, and Lincoln accepted. They shared that bed for 4 years. This is not unusual for the era. Bed sharing among men was common practice for reasons of economy and warmth, and anyone pointing this out is absolutely correct. What is somewhat less usual is what came after. When Speed eventually moved back to Kentucky, Lincoln wrote him letters describing his departure as a void in my heart that nothing can fill, when Speed became anxious about his upcoming marriage. Lincoln wrote him a series of letters of such careful, intimate, emotional reassurance that historians who study 19th century male friendship have described them as extraordinary, even by the standards of the day. Lincoln kept the Speed's letters for the rest of his life. Lincoln picked up his saddlebags, carried them upstairs, came back down, and said, with the slightly stunned gratitude of a man whose life has just become unexpectedly better, "Well, Speed, I am moved." They talked apparently about everything: law, politics, religion, women, the future, the particular quality of being young and ambitious in a small town in Illinois. Speed's door became the center of Lincoln's social world. When Speed left, Lincoln wrote the letters. When Lincoln himself married years later, he wrote to Speed about that too. Speed's letters were found among Lincoln's papers after his death. What followed was one of the most celebrated literary friendships in American history, and, depending on which scholar you consult, something that went somewhat beyond literary admiration. Melville dedicated Moby Dick to Hawthorne. He wrote him letters describing his feelings in terms that make Moby Dick seem like the more restrained document. I feel that the Godhead is broken up like the bread at the supper, he wrote, and that we are the pieces. I feel pantheistic then. Your heart beat in my ribs, and mine in yours, and both in God's. Hawthorne, characteristically, did not write back in quite the same register. Melville pursued the friendship with an intensity that Hawthorne eventually found difficult to match. When Hawthorne moved away and the correspondence dwindled, Melville's letters trail off into something that reads unmistakably like heartbreak. Note, not pleasure, not gratitude, not professional satisfaction, unspeakable security. The book being understood by this particular person has produced in him a feeling that he describes in terms of existential stability, as if Hawthorne's comprehension of the work is itself a kind of ground beneath his feet. Then there is the letter with the heartbeats. Your heart beat in my ribs and mine in yours. This is not a metaphor for literary influence or intellectual kinship. This is a description of physical interpenetration of two separate organisms. Sharing the same circulatory system, Melville was 32 when he wrote it, married with children, writing the greatest American novel. He wrote this to his neighbor, who was also a man. He appears to have been entirely earnest. In the year 130 C, the Roman Emperor Hadrian lost the person around whom his life had been organized. Antinous, a young man from Bithynia, drowned in the Nile. The circumstances were never conclusively established. Accident, suicide, deliberate sacrifice. What is not speculation is that Hadrian was devastated, and that the devastation was public and permanent. He wept. He named a city Antinopolis. He named a star. He deified him. The Antinous cult spread across the Mediterranean, and statues of the young man were commissioned in numbers that no other non-imperial figure in Roman history ever matched. There are more surviving portraits of Antinous than of any other figure from the ancient world except Augustus and Hadrian himself. The face that emerges from this consistency is distinctive enough to have a name in art history: the Antinous type. It is characterized by a particular heaviness of the lower lip, a slightly downcast quality to the eyes, hair that curls forward over the forehead in a specific and recurring pattern, and an expression that no art historian has quite managed to reduce to a single word. Dreamy is sometimes used, which is inadequate. Sorrowful is sometimes used, which is also inadequate. The expression suggests interiority, a person whose attention is directed somewhere inward rather than outward, who is present in the physical sense and slightly elsewhere in some other sense. Hadrian chose to show Antinous this way, not triumphant, not formally posed in the manner of imperial portraiture, but inward, slightly absent, beautiful in a way that is inseparable from a quality of absence that was already latent before the drowning made it permanent. Among the documents that survive from Ptolemy's court at Aachen is a collection of Latin verse exchanged between Charlemagne and his circle of scholarly courtiers. Alcuin of York, the most important scholar at Charlemagne's court, and his closest intellectual companion, exchanged with him a series of letters and poems describing their relationship in terms that medievalists have been annotating carefully for decades. Alcuin writes of longing for Charlemagne's presence, of the sweetness of their conversations, of missing him with an ache that disrupts his sleep and his prayers. He calls Charlemagne my dearest and the joy of my heart, and writes that he counts the days until they meet again. He writes, "Every day I await the arrival of your letters the way a sick man waits for medicine." He writes, "Your love is my comfort in every trouble." Charlemagne writes back in kind. The convention gave him the language. The man gave him the reason to use it. The phrase, "the love that dare not speak its name," appears in a poem written by Lord Alfred Douglas, the man Oscar Wilde called Bosie, the man for whom Wilde ultimately went to prison and then to ruin. Their relationship is, of all the pairs on this list, the one where history requires the least interpretive generosity. Wilde wrote Douglas letters describing his love in terms that left nothing ambiguous. Douglas wrote poetry about it. Wilde sued Douglas' father for criminal libel when the Marquess of Queensberry left a note accusing Wilde of being a sodomite, and in doing so handed the prosecution exactly the opportunity they needed to turn the lawsuit around. Wilde was convicted of gross indecency in 1895 and sentenced to 2 years of hard labor. He was 40 years old. He never recovered. When asked in court to explain the poem's phrase, Wilde gave one of the most celebrated speeches in the history of English legal proceedings, and was convicted anyway. He described a great affection between an older and a younger man, intellectual and spiritual, and entirely without shame, and Michelangelo, and Shakespeare, the court room, by Mao, multiple accounts, applauded. The judge then sentenced him to 2 years of hard labor. The applause had not been the point. Wilde served his sentence at Pentonville and then Reading jail. He wrote one long letter to Douglas while in prison, the document known as De Profundis. He went to Paris after his release, broke, largely avoided by former friends. Living under a pseudonym, he died in a cheap hotel room in 1900. Some habits survive everything. And before any of the others, before Alexander and Hephaestion, or Wilde and Douglas, there is David and Jonathan. The fact that this relationship is described in the oldest texts in the Western canon, with language that theologians have been untangling for 2,000 years. Jonathan, the son of King Saul, sees David for the first time, and the soul of Jonathan was knit to the soul of David, and Jonathan loved him as his own soul. Jonathan gives David his robe, his armor, his sword, his bow, his belt. When Saul turns against David, Jonathan warns him, protects him, meets him in secret. When Jonathan dies in battle, David's lament is preserved in the book of Samuel. Thy love to me was wonderful, passing the love of women. The Hebrew phrase used when Jonathan first sees David translates literally as, the soul of Jonathan was bound to the soul of David. The verb bound or knit is the same verb used elsewhere in the Hebrew Bible to describe the way a child is bound to a parent, not a casual connection, not a professional alliance, but a tying together of essential self to essential self to essential self. Thy love to me was wonderful, passing the love of women. The phrase has generated more theological footnotes than almost any other line in the Old Testament. David, who would go on to commit adultery with Bathsheba and arrange the death of her husband, who had multiple wives and concubines and the documented appetites for women, nevertheless described his love for Jonathan as something that passed beyond what he had for any of them. Whatever David meant, he meant something specific. So, tonight, as you settle into whatever comfortable position your modern furniture allows, on a mattress with springs, in a room where you can love whoever you love without the threat of prison or exile or execution, maybe spare a small thought for the men who lived in centuries where the love they felt was unspeakable and who spoke it anyway, in letters, in poems, in wreaths placed on parallel graves, in statues commissioned across an empire, in the words of Scripture itself. History called them friends. We can call them what they were. Sleep well. The love that dare not speak its name has been speaking for a very long time. We just